Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning into the show. We have another fantastic show ahead of us today on this lovely Tuesday morning. We are going to stick in the realm of betting odds a little bit, but this time in the realm of college sports. We're going to be looking at, for the first time ever, college basketball on our show, and we're also going to be looking at the updated college football betting odds and who are the favorites in those respective sports. Then I'm going to do an interesting little segment based off an article I read for ESPN where they did their own all-upside team for fantasy football in terms of who they believe has the most upside to them, and I'm going to make my own. And then, of course, we have some IDP player profiles to finish out the show today. Before we get into any of that, I want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned. And if you do feel so inclined, we receive a ton of tips and donations. Leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and ultimately the network as a whole. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them there as well, and they will be addressed and answered at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a fantastic segment. We're going to stick right in this little window right here and talk about the world of college basketball for the first time ever in the history of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I'm really excited about it. College basketball and March Madness in particular are some of the most exciting times in the sports world, and just being able to present to you the updated betting odds as we inch ever closer to the regular season in college basketball is something to behold. I really love these teams in the top 5. All of them can make the case for being the best team in the country and ultimately winning March Madness, or who knows, someone else outside of this field could rise and emerge as a dark horse contender, but this top 5 is pretty solid. So without further ado, let us jump right into it. Starting off with the number 5 team. This is a team that prides itself on defensive prowess and identity. And even though they lost perhaps one of the best, if not the best, point guards in the country, they found a solid replacement, and they're still returning players who want to use up their last years of eligibility. And that, of course, is the Houston Cougars. Obviously, Jamal Shead leaves. He has a steady metronomic presence at the point guard position. He was kind of the focal point of their offensive attack. He really made it tick. But when I think about Kelvin Sampson-led teams in particular, it's all about defensive identity. It's all about swarming to the basketball, getting bodies, and attacking in transition. And so I look at Houston and I look at their roster. There definitely are some players that can produce, but that's my main issue. Will there be enough offensive attack in order to sustain their heavy defensive presence? I like LJ Cryer. He's a solid three-point shooter. He's a solid perimeter player. I like J1 Roberts as well. Very physical guy. Javier Francis is going to continue to improve. And they also brought back Terrence Arsenault, one of the best defenders on the team. But can Milos Ujan, the transfer from Oklahoma, be that player at the point guard position that Jamal Shead was, who can really lead this offense during kind of tough stretches? Because that's what they need. And that's the ultimate question as we look at this Houston Cougars team at plus 1,600. I really think that the most value you can get out of them is if their defense carries them all the way through to the Final Four. But for now, I think that they're one of the teams that should be on the outside looking in at this top 5, because I don't necessarily know if they have all the pieces offensively to worry teams. And so the Houston Cougars, I think, can get there, but they're really going to have to rely on their defensive prowess mostly. Coming up next on the list is a team that's kind of becoming a little bit of a basketball school as well in terms of their college identity. The Alabama Crimson Tide coming in at number 4 at plus 1,200. And whereas Houston focuses on defense, Alabama is all offense, baby. Nate Oates preaches the offensive approach, putting up more shots than your opponent, specifically from three-point range. And they have one of the best three-point shooters in the country, one of the best point guards in the country, perhaps even the Wooden Award favorite for the best college basketball player in the country, in Mark Sears. I really think He's a solid player because he's not just a three-point player. He can shoot from anywhere on the field, and he's so aggressive in the way he plays. I like this pairing with him and Latrell Wrightsell. They bring in Chris Youngblood from South Florida at the small forward position. He can add a lot of value there. But I'm really liking the front court because that's where I thought Alabama struggled a little bit. I know that Grant Nelson kind of came into his own later in March Madness, especially in the Elite Eight games against North Carolina and such. But they really needed a dominant center. So what do? They went out and got one of the best ones on the transfer portal in Cliff Amory from Rutgers. I really like him, especially as a defensive rim protector. He blocks a lot of shots. He's aggressive in the defensive side of the ball. And I'm really liking the profile that this team is building. That being said, they still need to focus defensively on certain deficiencies they have there, because this team can be one of the most exciting teams in college basketball offensively. Their defensive woes hold them back a little bit. And so Nate Oates, I like that he diagnosed that they needed a center. They needed a presence in the middle of the key to grab rebounds, get blocks on the defensive side of the ball, and ultimately focus their attack more on building from the inside out. And so I really like Alabama because I know they can put up a lot of points, but they have the opposite problem that Houston does. So I still see them as also one of those teams that's looking up at these top three. Coming in at number 3 is probably my choice, in my humble opinion, to be the betting favorite and ultimately win March Madness in the Duke Blue Devils. I'm going to say something that might creep some people out, might irk some people about this Duke team. The winners of the U.S. exhibition games were not South Sudan for playing them tough. We're not Germany. We're not even the U.S. It was Duke, because their top 2 recruits, their top 2 2025 NFL draft, NBA draft prospects, I'm getting all my sports mixed up, Cooper Flagg, and I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly, Kaman Mulwalk, got the experience that they needed against these top players, and they ultimately seemed like 2 of the best players on the court when they played this Team USA that's supposed to be one of the most talented. And so I know this is going to be a one-and-done situation. Duke can never escape that, whether it be Coach Krzyzewski or now John Shire at the coaching position. It's never going to escape that mentality. But Cooper Flagg and Kaman Mulwalk can bring Duke back to the Zion Williamson days, where they were an entertaining, enjoyable team to watch. And with the experience and intelligence, and most importantly, of returning players Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster, you have this well-rounded unit who can really focus on bringing these 2 young players, these 2 5-star recruits, and ultimately guys who are going to play in the NBA for quite some time, bring the best out of them. And that's going to be really important, because when you look at Duke, their main problem last year was that they didn't have one of those special one-and-done players. I know it's weird to say, but they didn't really have a dominant presence who could just take over a game willfully and just impose their will on opposing defenses. They just had steady role players and no one star. And this year they have 2. And it's going to be very important that Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster, the experienced players of this team, get the ball to them, make them shine, because these 2 guys are really going to propel this Duke March Madness campaign. And at plus 1,000, it's a high value right here for this Duke side. But ultimately, I think these top 2 teams really are very intriguing in their own ways, and ultimately still have better depth. Without further, let's get the top 2. Coming in at number 2 is a team that ultimately perhaps had the best recruiting in terms of diagnosing problem areas, and also in coaxing back important players, and that is the Kansas Jayhawks. The most important part of their kind of off-season was getting back Hunter Dickinson, because he's ultimately one of the best, if not the best center in college basketball. Really a nice little presence, can work inside, fantastic defender. But they did lose a lot of production as well. And so they had to add through the transfer portal. They brought in Zeke Mayo from South Dakota State. I really like him. He's about a 20-point per game scorer. AJ Storr from Wisconsin, kind of an underrated star of that Wisconsin team from last year, coming in. They brought in Rylan Griffin, a sharpshooter from Alabama. And I really, really think this Kansas Jayhawks team is being underestimated because they have the center, they have the inside presence. Now they have the shooting and perimeter play that they believe they need. I like DeJuan Harris a lot. He's kind of like a stealthier point guard. And he is going to attack every time he's on the field. He might not score as many points, but I really think he adds that depth and experience to this team. And ultimately, when I look at Kansas, I think, why not them? Because even though they're going to bring a lot of people into the portal and they just want them to gel maybe, they are still the most well-rounded team based off their recruiting prowess and their ability to coax the best years and players to come back to their squad. But they don't have the aura and the coach of this next team. Number one, the team most likely to win March Madness according to betting odds, and the team looking to the repeat, the UConn Huskies. Now, I know that last year's team largely is not there. You have Donovan Clingan gone, Stephon Castle gone, Cam Spencer, who is a fantastic role player, gone. But I think why they're rated so highly at plus 900 is because of Dan Hurley deciding to stay, deciding to continue to build the UConn Huskies program, continuing to try and win championships every year he's there. He doesn't have the best players. Ultimately, the most experienced player is perhaps Alex Caravan. I really like him because he's very gritty, but they don't necessarily have a Donovan Clingan or a Stephon Castle anymore who can really be a steady presence for this team. They're going to have to rely on transfer Aiden Mahaney from St. Mary's, Lee McNeely, who was a top 10 recruit in the ESPN 100, and they're really going to have to, by hook or by crook, learn under Dan Hurley and trust in Dan Hurley's culture. It's going to be difficult to do because they're going to be relying on a team that doesn't necessarily have that much experience together. But if there's any college basketball coach I truly believe in, it is Dan Hurley. And I really think this group of kids still has that special juice in them to follow Dan Hurley and build a culture that's representative of them and their own selves, and how they play within that identity is ultimately what's going to be so integral to their three-peat campaign. So, while I don't think they ultimately can be the favorite, I still think they're a force to be reckoned with. They're always going to be in the conversation. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch from college basketball to college football to see the top 5 teams in terms of betting odds in that department. You don't want to miss that on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. I'm glad that I got to, for the first time ever, talk about college basketball on the show. But now we are going to transition to college football. But before we get into that, I want to remind you yet again to please consider donating or tipping at the link GSMC.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. So consider that. You can also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show there, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's transition from college basketball to college football, where there's a lot of heavy favorites, but in my humble opinion, this year is perhaps the most even. Whether it be through offensive talent or defensive prowess, all of these top 5 teams can make a case for winning the CFP. And I really see no weaknesses, unlike in the college basketball betting odds, in this top 5. I think any one of these teams is worthy of winning the CFP, and they definitely have the experience, the know-how, and the depth, most importantly, to do it. So without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Coming in at number 5 is a team, unlike in basketball, that seems to be in transition, but still has that culture and identity that they've always had, no matter who the coach is. It's not Nick Saban this year, but Kalen DeBoer certainly feels like he fits right in at Alabama. Bama, they lost a lot of production. That's always going to be the talking point about this team. They don't have the receiving depth they used to. They don't have the defensive depth they used to even. But the switch in culture is seamless from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer, as the players are finding out. He says all the right things. He knows what he wants this team to be, and he's willing to build around players who bought into him. And the X factor for him there is Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe could have gone to another college. He could have transferred. But he chose to stick with Kalen DeBoer and grow under him because he knows that his offensive talents can really transform this team. But that's the issue there. Do they have the receiving depth they used to have? Gone's Isaiah Bond. Gone too is even Amari Nyblack, who is looking to be a very promising tight end in that system. Now you're looking at guys like Jeremy Bernard, who was in this crowded University of Washington wide receiver room transfers with Kalen DeBoer. Only had about 500 yards. You're looking at Kobe Prentice, who's always been in this Bama receiver room but never really had the wide receiver one profile. You look at Kendrick Law, another one of those guys who stuck around. And you don't really see the depth that you need in order to sustain a guy like Jalen Milroe, who wants to get more comfortable throwing the football. And so when I look at Alabama, they have the quarterback. And that might just be enough, but I still think depth matters. Jalen Milroe is fine and dandy, but Kalen DeBoer is going to have to figure out how to fit all these kind of role-playing pieces together to build a coherent whole, a team that can compete in a very crowded SEC. But for Alabama to even be here in the top 5 is quite an achievement. I really think that they can sneak up on people. Coming in at number 4, our first Big Ten team, a new Big Ten team in the Oregon Ducks. And I really think that this Oregon Ducks team is one to be kind of slept on a little bit. 1 second here. My graphic doesn't seem to be working, but no matter. We will just talk about the Oregon Ducks. What I like about the Oregon Ducks is the fact that they went out and got a quarterback who I really, really like in terms of, in terms of experience and production. Dylan Gabriel. Being a Big 12 fan, as a Texas fan, Dylan Gabriel, I know, is a very frustrating quarterback to play against. He's just a very solid, calm, composed player. Over 10,000 yards in his career. And all is said and done, one of the best college football quarterbacks of perhaps the 21st century. And considering how Oregon has continued to build its culture under Dan Lanning, they really wanted to sustain that quarterback position. And getting Dillon Gabriel shows that they're all in to try and compete in a college football playoff again. Looking at this receiving core, it's definitely an interesting amalgamation of players. You have Tez Johnson, who had a decent year last year in this Oregon system, but then you bring in two guys who were kind of cast aside from their former teams, and Evan Stewart, who was a former four-star recruit out of Texas A&M, never really got going in the Jimbo Fisher era there. And then Trayshawn Holden, another one of those guys from that Alabama wide receiver room who's trying to make a name for himself. But he definitely has one of the more underrated wide receiver rooms in the country. Because if all of these guys coalesce and Dillon Gabriel is his normal self, then Oregon is definitely a team to be reckoned with, especially in the Big Ten, where it's definitely crowded at the top. You definitely have to worry about Michigan and Ohio State, who we're going to talk about a little later. But when all is said and done, Oregon is going to build around its offense and this quarterback in Dillon Gabriel, who is one of the most solid players in college football history. And that's what I like about them. Their defense as well is going to be very stout, as it always is. And they're not going to just fade away in the Big Ten. They are going to be in the reckoning every single year in the Big Ten. And so the Oregon Ducks are in a rightful place in this top 5, in my humble opinion. At plus 1,000, sorry I forgot to mention the betting odds, and Alabama was at plus 1,400. Coming in at number 3, my favorite team in the country, a team also moving to a different conference and looking to make its mark there, one of the conference favorites in the Texas Longhorns. The culture has shifted under Steve Sarkisian, and they mean business. They are a championship or bust college football team right now. And when I look at the profile of this Texas team, there are concerns about losing so much production on the offensive side of the ball. You don't have Jonathan Brooks anymore, the talented running back, who unfortunately tore his ACL. Oh, how things could have been different if he were healthy. You lose Xavier Worthy. You lose Jatavion Sanders, a brilliant tight end. You lose so much production, but they did so well in the transfer portal. Something that they don't really use that often. They bring in Isaiah Bond from Bama. They bring in Nia Black from Alabama. They bring in Matthew Golden from Houston and Silas Bolden from Oregon State. And they're really building a nice core. And don't forget about 5-star freshman Ryan Wingo. I really liked his spring game. They just have so much talent. And Quinn Ewers, they have a reliable, steady quarterback. You can talk about his consistency issues. But when all is said and done, if he rounds into form, he is one of college football's best quarterbacks. And I really believe that in perhaps his final year in college football, he's going to have something to say. Not just as a quarterback, but in the Heisman race and in the CFP perhaps. Looking at the SEC, they definitely have one of the easier schedules. They have some tough tests to navigate in Michigan, Georgia, and obviously the Red River rivalry for the first time in the SEC against Oklahoma. But they still should be there and thereabouts in the SEC. I think the question is about their defense. Who's going to step up? Can Anthony Hill at linebacker step up? Who's going to step up in the secondary? Can Jahdae Barrett and Barron Sorrell be solid players? Can Alfred Collins fill in the holes left on that interior defensive line with the absences of Devondre Swen and Byron Murphy? How can this Texas Longhorn team improve on defense? If they do, then I think they are the favorite in the SEC. But for now, they're the number 3 team in terms of overall betting odds. Coming in at number 2, perhaps the most talked about team of this past off-season. Perhaps one of the deepest wide receiver rooms, the best wide receivers in the country. And it's all going to come down to their starting quarterback, another transfer quarterback as well, in the Ohio State Buckeyes. They bring in Will Howard from Kansas State to be their quarterback. And in my honest opinion, he just has to be like what Kyle McCord was last year. He just has to be a serviceable enough quarterback to make all his receivers happy. Because Becca Ibuka definitely is someone who is one of the best all-around wide receivers in college football. Should be the top wide receiver in the 25 NFL draft class. You have freshman Jeremiah Smith, who has been talked about so highly after the spring game. You have Julian Fleming still. You have so much depth at the wide receiver position that I really like. Carnell Tate as well, another 4-star freshman recruit. And if they truly believe in the depth of this wide receiver room, and these wide receivers truly live up to their billing, then that's all I think Ohio State needs. Their defense is solid. They have such depth and experience. One of the most experienced defenses in the Big Ten and in college football. When I look at Ohio State, all I'm concerned about is Will Howard. How is he going to translate to a more pressurized culture? Coming from Kansas State, he basically lived with being accepted as a serviceable college football quarterback. Now, the nation's eyes are going to be upon him every single game, especially in the Big Ten that's now more crowded than ever. So, can Will Howard deliver? If so, then Ohio State's definitely a favorite. If not, maybe they fall a bit behind in the pack. But for now, they definitely are one of the most exciting college football teams on paper. So keep your eye out for them. And plus 450, Texas was plus 750. This is kind of where you see the chasm between these teams. But coming in number one, obviously, no surprise here, is the Georgia Bulldogs. So I don't know why I put the UConn Huskies there. The Georgia Bulldogs definitely are a team that wants redemption. They definitely are a team that is going to cast aside the goings on of last year. They didn't make the CFP when they absolutely could have and should have. Just a solid all-around team. They don't necessarily have the depth at the wide receiver position, much like Bama actually. They still have Carson Beck, who led the entire country in completion percentage. Just a solid presence. Definitely kind of reminds me of a Stetson Bennett-esque kind of player who's just going to get the ball to all his weapons and distribute the wealth. But some of his weapons are gone. Gone are Brock Bowers. Gone is Ladd McConkey. Now you're going to rely on guys such as Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas. And I think that the X factors in this offense are going to be the new tight ends in Stanford transfer Benjamin Yurosek and Oscar Delp. How are they going to fit into the scheme? How are they going to profile? Because that's going to be very important for Georgia, because Carson Beck is one of those quarterbacks who I feel relies a lot on timing, and if the pace of the offense is not up to par, that's where you can really start to attack Georgia. If something is thrown out of rhythm, if something goes awry offensively, that's the weakness in Georgia. And this time they don't have many security blankets to fall back on. You don't have Brock Bowers to bail you out. You don't have Ladd McConkey to bail you out. You have to rely on this kind of inexperienced receiving core and see what you can make of it. And that's the ultimate task. If so, then they definitely are the favorites at plus 330 to win the championship. But if not, much like with Bama's issues, then they fall behind in the pack. This should just about do it for this segment of these betting odds. Hope you guys like it. Coming up next, we have an interesting segment where I make my own all-upside team based on an ESPN article that I read in the recent past. Hope you guys will enjoy it. We will be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far. I enjoyed breaking down the betting odds, especially in college sports where the atmosphere is just incredible surrounding the fandoms involved in each and every sport. But we are now transitioning to the world of fantasy football, where after reading an intriguing article about this all-upside team, I thought, why not create my own all-upside team and see how you guys react to it. I think that my all-upside team definitely has some very interesting players on it. I decided to do 2 at every position outside of quarterback, and I really think that this all-upside team makes a lot of sense. After reading ESPN's article, I hope it lives up to that hype, because this idea seemed very fun to me, and so without further ado, I just want to present my findings. Just like I said, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, 1 QB. My 1 QB is a guy who did have a highly down year last year. Definitely kind of regressed to the mean in a sophomore season, a sophomore slump that highly translated to the latter stage of the season when his team was trying to make the playoffs and they ultimately fell up short in the AFC South, and that is Trevor Lawrence. I still think Trevor Lawrence has a lot of upside. You can talk all you want about whether or not he deserved that much money, but they still trust him. They still believe he has the generational talent that, not since Andrew Luck, has had the most upside in NFL history at the QB position. And I really think what it came down to was Trevor Lawrence last year didn't necessarily have a wide receiver he could call his wide receiver 1 that could bail him out. That's what I talked about a little bit recently when I did a player profile on Trevor Lawrence, or actually Evan Engram, who was his best weapon last year. When I think about Trevor Lawrence, I think that he's most comfortable when he's familiar with at least someone's game. I like that they brought in Travis Etienne to help him in the backfield. He was his teammate at Clemson, obviously. But I really believe that Trevor Lawrence is a little fearful of being aggressive. In order to be aggressive, you need that number 1 receiver. The reason why I believe that Trevor Lawrence has a lot of upside this year, especially in fantasy, is because Brian Thomas could be that guy. Christian Kirk, when I think about him, definitely seems to be the wide receiver 1 at the moment in Jacksonville. But when I think about him, he's just all speed. He's just all verticality. He's just yards after catch. He doesn't offer you much in the way of route running. He has decent hands. But when all is said and done, he's just a guy who, when he gets the ball, just runs at the field. He doesn't offer any particular skill set outside of speed that I see. Brian Thomas definitely does. He's not just a vertical threat. He's not just a deep threat, but he has good hands. He has explosivity. He has yards after contact. And most importantly, he can run any routes given to him. Obviously, he's going to have to learn a deeper route tree in this Jacksonville system because at LSU it was all about verticality and explosivity to exploit Jaden Daniels' talents. But in order to unlock Trevor Lawrence, he just needs someone who is just reliable. He doesn't have to have a deep threat every single time. He just needs a guy who can get him quick yardage and keep him on pace. And don't forget, Trevor Lawrence, for as bad a year as he had last year, was 10th in passing yards. That has to stand for something. And I think that he ultimately is a quarterback who I'm going to say is always going to be in the reckoning for fantasy football. If he can expel all the notions about whether or not he's deserving of money, whether or not he's going to translate it onto the field, I still think he's a guy you can't underestimate or undervalue, because when all is said and done, he still is that guy who, coming out of college, was praised so highly. Into the running back position, these are 2 guys we talked about a lot on this show, perhaps one more than the other, but these are 2 guys who now have opportunities in their respective offenses to really shine, whether it be due to injury with one or the fact that a stalwart running back left for the other. These 2 guys are definitely going to be highly valued in fantasy leagues everywhere, and they are Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans and Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. Let's start with Tyjae Spears because he's one of those running backs who you always have to talk about now. He seems to be popping up everywhere as a sleeper draft pick in fantasy leagues everywhere. And it makes a lot of sense because on a Titans team that is in transition, you lose Derrick Henry at the running back position. You bring in Will Levis, a very talented, full of moxie kind of guy, but still needs a full season to get acclimatized to the league. You have a solid receiving core, actually, with Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins as your top 2 guys. But when I look at the running back position, it's wide open. And it's Tyjae Spears to take. And In flashes of brilliance last year, he proved that he can take that spot. And he can be the guy who can really settle Will Levis down, get him into a tempo. I really think the Tennessee Titans as a whole are a team that's going to be slept on this year. If Tyjae Spears can just be a guy who could add value out of the backfield, not just as a rusher, but as a receiver, I think this guy's really going to shine. And the Tennessee Titans definitely have the makeup of a shock team. I think a lot of these players on the Tennessee Titans could be sleeper draft picks, especially a guy like Will Levis. He has the arm strength, so make of that what you will. Tyjae Spears, definitely a very exciting player, and one with a lot of upside. When you look at Jerome Ford, on the other hand, Nick Chubb, definitely coming back from injury, might not be the same as he's been in the past. He's definitely getting up there in age. I still think he has some left in the tank. He's still 29 years old. He's not yet into the ugly 30s that kind of lead to the nadir of your NFL career. But Jerome Ford leads very important stats. In the time he was on the field, he led a lot of categories where it was yards after contact, a lot of explosive runs, a lot of runs of 20-plus yards or more. And that's what you kind of want in a fantasy running back. You want one guy who's very balanced, who can get you a lot of touchdowns, but maybe not as much yards. And you want another guy who can just explode. You want another guy like Jerome Ford. And in a very shaky running back room at the moment, where they might have to rely on Ford a lot more than they expected, look for Jerome Ford to be a guy who ultimately breaks out in a way that these young Cleveland Browns can build upon. He might be the best offensive player when all is said and done, in my humble opinion. Yeah, that's a very hot take, but think about it. Deshaun Watson's not his usual self. That might go down as the worst deal in NFL history. You definitely have Amari Cooper, but he's also getting up there in age. Jerry Jeudy, I don't necessarily like him as a wide receiver too, but it is what it is. And you have Elijah Moore as well, but when all is said and done, I think Jerome Ford has the opportunity to be a huge breakout star for the Cleveland Browns. At the wide receiver position, these are two guys who are no-brainers, Drake London and Rome Odunze. Drake London for obvious reasons. He now has a quarterback who can trust. And without a quarterback he could trust, he already had 2 1,000-yard seasons. And with Kirk Cousins, he's definitely not the most sexy quarterback, but he is someone who has the experience and know-how, and he had a top receiver in Justin Jefferson, who he made very happy. And he can get the ball to his top guys, obviously, in a system where you want a lot of people to remain happy. You have a lot of players and weapons to work in, like Bijan Robinson and Kyle Pitts and Tyler Algier as well, if he gets some action. So it's definitely going to be very competitive, but when all is said and done, Drake London is the number one guy in the Atlanta Falcons offense. And this year especially, I think, is the year that Drake London becomes a guy, a household name in fantasy drafts, a guy that you can always look to. And Rome Odunze is just there because, well, him and Caleb Williams have the similarities of being two rookies coming into the league together, and they want to grow together as well. I think that is a very competitive wide receiver room. He definitely profiles as the wide receiver 3 on paper, in a room that includes Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. But I really think that Caleb Williams is going to rely on him a lot because of his rookie similarities, and they're going to grow together a lot. And I think those two are going to be the constants in the Chicago Bears offense, because Keenan Allen's not going to be there for as long as people expect. And DJ Moore, while he definitely profiles as a guy who's going to stay there, definitely is not necessarily a wide receiver 1 type. So I think this year is where they find that Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze can be the guys to build around. Then, last but not least, let's go to the tight end position. These two guys are guys who are just going to work the middle of the field really well and be on offenses who can be sneakily good, maybe one over the other, but two guys who really are going to get a lot of targets in offenses that kind of need their production, and Trey McBride and Brock Bowers. Trey McBride is in a Cardinals system where he might be the top quote-unquote receiver in that system. I think this offense is still going to go because Kyler Murray is back in, and I think that there's just too much upside with him at the QB position to not consider him someone who can get this offense ticking. But the wide receiver room is very thin, and Trey McBride certainly needs to be his self that he was at the latter stages of last season in order for this offense to be one of the more potent ones in the league, one of the more surprising ones in the league, nevertheless. And so I really like him in his upside as a tight end. And then Brock Bowers, obviously starting this new tight end revolution that we'll always talk about, where in a Las Vegas system that might rely a lot more on physicality and short yardage play, Brock Bowers could be kind of the code breaker for this team, kind of the guy who can work the middle of the field, get easy yardage for either Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell, whoever emerges as the starting QB in that conversation. And ultimately, when I look at this all-upside team, I really like all of these players. And I really think that they have opportunities now at each respective position to shine due to whatever circumstances came about to lead them to this position. That's what I like about them. That should just about do it for the segment. We are switching to the IDP player profiles. Coming up next on the show, we talk about two more secondary players who I really believe are going to find their footing yet again. We'll be right back to discuss them after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far. A lot of fun segments, but now we're transitioning to the IDP player profiles. A kind of a stalwart segment on the show over the past couple of weeks as we get closer to fantasy football season. And these next two guys that I'm going to talk about stick in the secondary, as we've done in the recent past. These are two guys who, similarly to some other guys I've talked about, are guys who are trying to regain their footing as two of the better position players at their respective positions in the secondary. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. And we'll start off with a guy from the New Orleans Saints who really profiled as someone who can be an aggressor in this young Saints secondary that seems to be in transition, but just needs to learn how to harness it, in Marshawn Lattimore. And I'm going to say something mainly not necessarily about Marshawn Lattimore, but more about the profile of the Saints as a whole that is highly integral to how I view the season going for them. In the NFC South, the Saints secondary is going to be the most important group of players on any team in that division. And here's why. When I think about every NFC South team, I think of decency. I don't see a team that's consistent. I don't see a team that's superior to the others. I see decency. And when I think about what breakthroughs these teams can make, I think it's going to come on the defensive side of the ball. Takeaways ultimately are going to be the barometer for how we kind of see and analyze these NFC South teams. Because takeaways are going to matter a lot in this division especially. And when I look at all the secondaries, I like the Bucs a lot. The Falcons are getting there, and the less we say about the Panthers, the better. But out of all the secondaries, the one with the most upside, the one with the most potential, the one who has the players who are experienced enough to lead this youthful movement, is the New Orleans Saints. And for an offense that's average at best, perhaps the definition of average in the NFL. Derek Carr is the definition of average at the QB position. Alvin Kamara has kind of fallen off a little bit. They have Chris Olave, who's one of the better receivers in the league, but it's definitely average. The main force for this team is going to have to be its secondary. The defensive front can do its thing too, but the secondary for the Saints is going to be the reason why this division is so competitive. And Marshawn Lattimore is going to be a reason as well. Let's look at how he profiles. 519.5 fantasy points in his career. He had 97 in 2018, his best season. 39 solo tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 8 passes defended, 1 interception last year. Kind of battled injuries. But in 90 games, he has 66 pass breakups, 50 interceptions, 5 forced fumbles. And like I said before, he probably is the most aggressive corner in the league. Probably the most aggressive safety in the league. And when I look at this Saints secondary, him and the Honey Badger Tyrann Mathieu are going to be what sets this Saints secondary apart in the NFC South. What's really going to matter in the NFC South, like I said, is having 2 guys who are experienced and can create turnovers and wreak havoc. In terms of the youth in the system, I really like them. I like Paulson Adebo. He's a guy who's actually been around the league a little bit. They brought in Kool-Aid McKinstry to the draft. He's going to be someone who's going to be fantastic. Just needs to learn different coverage schemes, and I think he'll be a fantastic fit for the New Orleans Saints. You have Jordan Howden, who's in his second or third year in the league out of Minnesota, coming into his own. And I really like how the Saints are viewing the secondary. We've talked about this a lot in terms of how to build secondaries. You can either do it through developmental prospects, or you can do it through kind of having the experience already there, like Darius Slay, per se. And you can have that kind of be this melding of youth and experience, so that when these young players are fully ready, and you're ready for these older guys to retire or move on, then you can just jump right into this youthful movement. The Saints are probably the best example because Marshawn Lattimore and Tyrann Mathieu have not necessarily been their true selves. They've been plagued with injuries. They've had down years. Tyrann Mathieu's getting up there in age. He's entering his age 33 season. And Marshawn Lattimore, perhaps his aggressive style of play is getting to him. And that's the caveat here. When you're a guy like Marshawn Lattimore, and you're in the Saints defense, who relies a lot on man-to-man coverage, especially press coverage, you really want to set the tone at the line of scrimmage. You really want to jam your receiver, make him uncomfortable. Marshawn Lattimore, that's his bread and butter move. He's very aggressive, very handsy. But ultimately, that's kind of been the reason why a lot of pundits are skeptical about him. Can he be disciplined so that A, he himself can be a better player, and B, the Saints secondary doesn't necessarily have to worry about the kind of plays that set you back. And so Marshawn Lattimore, in terms of discipline, definitely has a potential weakness. But in terms of strengths, he can be very aggressive, and sometimes that aggressiveness results into positive plays for the defense. I still think he can add a lot of value in terms of defending passes. He adds a lot of value in terms of interceptions. But when all is said and done, the Saints need him to be is someone who, like I said, melds the experience with the youth. Because right now, these Saints players need a role model. Tyrann Mathieu can be that guy, but he's on the older side. Marshawn Lattimore is still one of those players who has good years left in him if he can get his head right and help develop the Saints secondaries. Because the Saints secondary is not going to be the most important in the NFC South for just 1 year. They're going to be the most important for as long as these teams don't really have many differences between them. I mean, yeah, you can say the Falcons are an exciting team, but that's on paper. Yeah, you can say the Bucs can find some levels of consistency. Maybe Baker Mayfield has another fantastic season, but it remains to be seen. I really believe that defenses are the key to the NFC South. And in terms of IDP, you might want to take a swing on Marshawn Lattimore because the Saints secondary are going to be the most heavily scrutinized unit in the NFC South. That's my honest opinion. And Marshawn Lattimore, therefore, is perhaps going to be the most scrutinized player in the NFC South as well because of his place in the Saints system. So, the question for you as fantasy managers, as IDP fantasy managers is Marshawn Lattimore truly viable based off his style of play? The answer could be yes. The answer could be no. But just know that he's always going to be the center of attention for quite some time in the Saints secondary. There's no reason as to think that Marshawn Lattimore can't get back to what he can be. He just has to A, be the aggressive player, but to a certain extent in moderation. And B, realize that he now has to be the face of this defense in order for it to transition properly and be a seamless transition. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we're talking about a guy who I am very familiar with as he went to my high school in Minkah Fitzpatrick. Very exciting segment. I love talking about this guy. He makes me very proud to have gone to St. Peter's Prep. Shout out Prep. But we'll be right back to talk about him right after this break. Hello everyone and welcome back to today's last segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And this segment is perhaps the most exciting of all because I'm talking about a guy who kind of hits close to home. Makes me proud to talk about him because he graduated from my high school and has made it to the NFL. And we couldn't be prouder of him. Go St. Peter's Prep. We are of course talking about the great Minkah Fitzpatrick. And much like Marshawn Lattimore, Minkah Fitzpatrick is in a situation where he is kind of the bridge to a new generation for the Steelers secondary. The Steelers defense is always going to be one of the best, top to bottom in the NFL, for as long as they have a guy like TJ Watt up front. But when we look at the Steelers secondary, it, much like the Saints secondary, is getting much younger. They're going to start a rookie corner, no matter the name and the brand that he brings, and Joey Porter Jr. at the left side. And they need someone to kind of be the vocal leader of the secondary group. I don't necessarily see many household names outside of Minkah Fitzpatrick and maybe Joey Porter Jr. if he lives up to his billing as a rookie, that can really make names for themselves in this Steelers secondary. And so yet again, I'm talking about a guy who has a unique opportunity to really be the bridge. Minkah Fitzpatrick can always be that guy, and I trust in him. Let's go over his stats. 599.5 fantasy points throughout his career. 125 in 2021 was his best season. Last year, 43 solo tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 3 passes defended. In his first 5 seasons in the NFL, Minkah Fitzpatrick has 19 interceptions and 47 pass breakups. So you can see the level of production he has been able to bring to the Steelers secondary. And the free safety position, he's definitely going to be the guy who gets the most attention. He's always the center of attention as the last line of defense. But here's the reason why he's much unlike Marshawn Lattimore and why the pundits are a little bit skeptical about him now. Unlike Marshawn Lattimore, he's not playing as close to the line where he could wreak havoc both in terms of interception production and kind of being a free safety blitzer. And so, if he can get back to that, he's definitely going to be someone for this free safety position that I talked about a lot that is highly undervalued, especially in IDP leagues. You can't really find many good ones in the league. If Minkah Fitzpatrick can become that blitzing guy that we all know and love, he can find that aggressive streak a little bit more, kind of like the antithesis of what I've been talking about with Marshawn Lattimore. I think that Minkah Fitzpatrick is going to be back to his former self. Not to say that his former self is gone, because he is still one of the more consistent players in the secondary. But they certainly need an aggressor here. Because when I look at the secondary, like I said, it's much like the Saints. It's not as important as the Saints because ultimately I really like the Steelers front a little bit more than the Saints. You added Patrick Queen this year. You still have TJ Watt. Larry Ogunjobi is highly underrated on the end as well. Cameron Hayward, when he comes back from injury, is going to be very solid. So I like the depth of the Steelers defense. The issues that I mainly have, the concerns I have, lie in the secondary outside of, say, Minkah Fitzpatrick and Joey Porter Jr. Because I don't necessarily feel like there's much trust in the system anymore. I don't necessarily feel as if these players are feeling ingrained into a culture that preaches high intensity. If we're talking about a guy like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who we know is going to be someone who's going to be scrutinized in the secondary for many years to come, for as long as he stays there, when we talk about them, if they're seeing someone who's not playing aggressive as a leader, who's not trying to force the issue and speak like, hey guys, here's what we can do to improve, then how is that going to translate to how they develop? Especially when I look at these corners that they have. I look at Joey Porter Jr. and Dante Jackson. These are guys with a lot of potential. I really believe that should Joey Porter Jr. be the guy who they really think they can be his rookie year, I think that they need to focus on him and Minkah Fitzpatrick as the two guys that they want to lead their secondary. And ultimately, when I look at those two, there's a clear favorite as to who ultimately is going to be the guy who is tasked with getting the secondary up to speed. And that's Minkah Fitzpatrick. Now, transitioning back to this aggression point, I don't necessarily think Fitzpatrick has to be as aggressive as I think he should be. Because the Steelers' defense is primed and prepared for that aggressive identity. You have guys in your front like TJ Watt, like Patrick Queen now, like Cameron Hayward, who are so good at diagnosing weaknesses in opposing offenses that your secondary can, to a degree, focus on coverage. And so, finding that balance where Minkah Fitzpatrick can focus on coverage can really prepare these young players for different opposing offenses, however these receivers attack them. And then finding places where Minkah Fitzpatrick can be Minkah Fitzpatrick and come up in the blitz. That's what's going to separate Minkah Fitzpatrick from other free safeties. His ability to understand that coverage is going to be important for this young secondary. Coverage is going to be important to how they transition once Minkah Fitzpatrick leaves the league. Coverage is going to be ultimately what gets them their stats and their production. But in moderation, aggression is key. Because aggression, more importantly, allows you to play with a certain sense of freedom and a certain sense of identity. And the Steelers always preach identity. No matter what, I feel as if this could be a win-win proposition for Minkah Fitzpatrick. Because not only is he proving to be a leader of this team, he's proving to be someone who is going to be, for many years, a guy who can come to be respected for realizing that balance. Because he's fine and comfortable with not being the overall star of this defense. Because it's always going to be TJ Watt that gets all the plaudits and the laudatory praises and stuff of that nature. Minkah Fitzpatrick, what he's going to be remembered for is this season specifically. This is a pivotal year for Fitzpatrick. I know it's kind of cliche to continue saying that, but this definitely feels like a very pivotal year. Because the Steelers secondary believes in these players that they have. It believes that Joey Porter Jr. can be the guy in corner for many years and man that position. It believes that Minkah Fitzpatrick can be that vocal leader. And so, if it translates, then the payoff is going to be very huge. That basically means that at every level, I can't necessarily pinpoint one specific weakness on the Steelers' defense. That means that in terms of IDP, you could have at least one player from every single position from the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's what I really hope for this team. That's what I really am highly optimistic about. Because you have TJ Watt at the linebacker position. You have guys like Ogunjobi and Hayward in your front. You have a guy in Patrick Queen who's going to be the quarterback of the whole defense. And then the secondary is what's really promising. And Minkah Fitzpatrick, has gained the respect of everyone for his play. But right now is the time for him to say, hey, I'm going to be the vocal leader for this group. I'm going to be the player in the Steelers secondary where everyone says, when they look back at this era of Steelers football, that was able to launch a new generation, new evolution of Steelers secondary players. Because when you look at Steelers secondaries of the past, they've always had that profile. They had Troy Polamalu. They've had so many good players. Even going back to the Steel Curtain defenses. They've had players in their secondary who was able to lead to this point. And Minkah Fitzpatrick's going to have to propel that forward. He's going to have to pay it forward. And he's been doing it for so long. But now is the year where it's different. Now is the year where balance comes into play, like I said. Now is the year where Minkah Fitzpatrick can fully realize his place as perhaps the best free safety in the NFL. And Steelers are going to need it. The Steelers definitely feel like they need a player at every level to get them to that spot. Can Minkah Fitzpatrick be that? We'll ultimately have to see. But that will just about do it for this show. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. I've been Christopher Shepard here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. Nice little mix of segments. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow for Hump Day. A great show ahead, full of betting odds. No IDP player profiles tomorrow. So I hope you guys will enjoy that show. Thank you yet again for tuning in.